the interview with Pastor Hill. And so they come, and very often, as they're waiting out there in the lobby, I can see them kind of worried about that encounter, what it's going to be. And afterwards, when they come out, they're smiling, and they're happy, and maybe they're glad or relieved, but, it's all over. And yet they've had a chance to bring everything together. 3 years of preparation, which actually began for them on the day they were baptized many, many years before that. There's something about that one-on-one encounter with somebody that we see as being in authority that is somewhat scary to us, and yet it's somewhat important for us. Because think about it, how many times in your life do you get a chance to sit down with somebody who you respect, who will listen to you as you share something about your own self and about your faith and about your life and about your issues in life? There aren't that many opportunities that come along. And that's what we try to provide as part of the culmination of the team ministry program, that one-on-one kind of opportunity. Now, in the Gospel of John, if you look through the Gospel of John carefully, you'll see that that is the way Jesus dealt with people time and time and time again. There are many, many instances in the Gospel of John where Jesus is dealing with people as individuals. Individuals. For example, we think of Nicodemus. He came to Jesus by night. He was a ruler. He was a Pharisee. He was a leader. He came to Jesus by night, probably because he was afraid to be seen during the day. But he came by night, and he had a chance to meet with Jesus one-on-one. And that changed his life. And then in the next chapter of John's Gospel, we hear about a woman who was sitting by a well, and Jesus came along, and all of a sudden her life was transformed by that conversation with Jesus at the well. And later on, a man who had been lying around in a bed for 38 years is set free from his paralysis by Jesus, who dealt with him on an individual basis. And again, we hear about Jesus coming to the man who was blind from birth and giving him the gift of sight, something he had never experienced before. We hear about the one-on-one encounter between Jesus and Pontius Pilate when Jesus is on trial. And one almost wonders whether Pontius Pilate himself did not eventually come to faith in God. And then there is the story of Mary Magdalene, who comes to the tomb early on that Easter morning and discovers that the tomb is empty. Those one-on-one encounters, they're a very powerful part of the Gospel of John because they teach us something about who Jesus is. And they give us a clear insight into the heart of God. But it's this last one-on-one encounter that we have in the Gospel lesson today. And this occurs in the very last chapter of the Gospel according to St. John. In fact, this last chapter of John's Gospel was probably, according to most scholars, something that was added on sometime later, after the Gospel of John had been essentially put together. It was added on, and some might say, well then, is it really the Gospel of John? But the other question I would ask is, why was it so important to have this story that it was added to the Gospel of John? It is an encounter between Jesus and Peter. This all takes place, of course, after Jesus has shown them, that they were fishing on the wrong side of the boat. And he says, throw your nets on the right side of the boat, fellas. And they come up with a huge net load of fish. But now, by this charcoal fire, Jesus is sitting down with Peter. And he asks him 3 simple questions. In fact, it's basically the same question asked 3 times. And each time, Peter has a chance to answer it. It reminds us of that other charcoal fire that Peter sat beside on the night of Jesus' betrayal in the courtyard of the high priest, when the maid came to him and said, aren't you one of his followers? And he said, I don't know the man. And 3 times he was asked the same question, and 3 times he denied ever knowing Jesus. Now, there he is, sitting by another charcoal fire. And Jesus asked him a question. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? The word that Jesus uses for love is the word that we use when we talk about God's love. Do you have unconditional love, unrestricted love, total commitment to me? And Simon Peter responds, well, Lord, you know, we're really good buddies. Now, that's not the right answer. Can you imagine if you're married, that, you're married and you say to your spouse, do you really love me? And your spouse says to you, well, we're kind of close. It just doesn't quite make it, you know. Nevertheless, Jesus doesn't give up with him. He says, feed my lambs. Then he asks him the second time, Simon, do you love me? And the same word for love is used there. And again, he answers, well, we're really, really close. He says, tend my sheep. Then the third time Jesus asks him the question, Simon is getting upset now because he's asked him the question 3 times. He still hasn't got it. He still doesn't realize why it had to be 3 times that he was asked this question. And finally, he says, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus says to him, feed my sheep. What was going on here is that Jesus was reinstating Simon Peter. He was giving him a place again among the disciples. He was welcoming him back as the leader of the church. Back in the Roman Catholic tradition, Peter is referred to as a great fisherman, the first pope. And indeed, he did serve that role in the life of the early church as a leader of the Christian community. But what is even more important is that Jesus was sharing his ministry with Peter, and by implication with all the other disciples, and ultimately with us. That's what Jesus was doing there by the Sea of Galilee. And that is the final, the portion of the story according to St. John. That is the culmination of everything that John has been saying about Jesus. That ultimately, when Jesus is all said and done, what he is saying to Peter and what he's saying to us is, now it's your turn. You have this ministry. I'm turning it over to you. And from now on, you need to continue the mission that I began. And isn't that the theme of what's going on in the first lesson today when you hear the story of Saul going on his way to Damascus? He's going to arrest Christians there and bring them back and put them on trial. And instead Jesus meets him along the way. The risen Lord Jesus meets him along the way. And he is totally transformed by that experience. And he becomes a missionary, not to the Jewish people, but to the Gentile community, to the non-Jewish community, to the rest of the world, in other words. And so Jesus is saying, my mission must continue. And that's why I've chosen you, Saul. And then when we hear the second lesson from the book of Revelation, we see the vision that John saw. They're looking at the throne of God and seeing myriads and myriads, thousands and thousands of saints gathered around this throne of God. And if that is not a tremendous, wonderful affirmation of the mission that God has given to the church, there is nothing that would ever qualify for that. But Jesus is saying to us, my mission must continue, and you are the ones through whom it must continue. And how fitting it is that we have this lesson today when we celebrate the rite of confirmation. Because if confirmation means anything at all in the life of the church, it means that the mission continues. The mission Jesus began 2,000 years ago continues. That's what's so important about this day. You may have come here thinking you're graduating from a confirmation program of 3 years, but the reality is you are stepping up. You're standing up. You are moving forward as servants of the Lord, as disciples of Jesus. You're taking on your shoulders the responsibility for the mission that Jesus has entrusted to us all. And that is a wonderful privilege indeed. That's what confirmation is all about. That's what I hope you'll remember about confirmation. When someone asks you, were you confirmed? I hope you'll be able to say, not only, yes, I was confirmed, but it's made a difference in my life. Because now I'm not the same person I was the day I came to that church to be confirmed. Now I understand who I really am as a servant of God, as a follower of Jesus. Now I know that the gifts that God has given to me are something that are not to be squandered and not to be kept to myself, but rather are something that can be shared and will be a blessing and will touch and change the lives of many other people. The mission continues. That's what it's all about. And you are living proof that the risen Christ is continuing his mission in the world today. As you affirm your baptism, as your faith is confirmed by the church, as you stand up and go in peace and serve the Lord, you do so knowing that this Christ, this risen Lord, who is present there in the New Testament times, is also present here in the 21st century, and he's present in you. I hope you'll never forget that. Because ultimately, you see, that the one question that Jesus asked Peter is the same question he asks of everyone who is baptized. And that's a very basic question. He doesn't ask you, do you know the Apostles' Creed? Can you recite the meaning of the Ten Commandments? Can you give me all the books of the Old Testament in order? He doesn't say to you, can you turn in 25 sermon responses? Those things are important as part of a confirmation program. But what is really important, what really matters in the end, is none of that stuff. The only thing that really matters is how do you answer the question Jesus asked Peter. Do you love me? Do you love Jesus? That's the question.